Good evening, everyone. We are so excited to welcome you to tonight's PBS NewsHour Extra official launch of the Journalism in Action website, just in time for Media Literacy Week. The full name is Civic Engagement and Primary Sources Through Key Moments in History. These resources are from the Library of Congress. We have 10 case studies, 10 points in history, where we have students look at the journalism of the time. We have them study the journalist, the news format, and the actual historical event itself. And they go through radio and TV transcripts and videos and old broadsides and newspapers and photographs and you name it. Well, we are very pleased to say that in one of our case studies, we have NewsHour's own Judy Woodruff, who appears in our final case study, and it's on gender equality. And so as I'm scrolling down, you guys can see this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as we're scrolling down to more modern times, we actually start our gender equality in the 1700s. But we have Judy Woodruff and Gwen Eiffel, of course. For those of you who didn't know, the Judy Woodruff and Gwen were actually the first two women in history to co-anchor a primetime national news broadcast. And so we're so pleased to have Judy here tonight. And so thank you, Judy. And we'll be exploring the Journalism in Action website throughout, but we just wanted to give a warm welcome to Judy and to Michelle Chula Lipkin, who's the head of NAMELY, the National Association of Media Literacy Education. And before I go on any further, I want to introduce our host, Beth Rosenberg. So I actually disappeared from the chat for a little while. Beth Rosenberg, our host, is an award-winning U.S. history teacher and writer. She's been teaching U.S. history at the High School for Environmental Studies, a public high school in New York City, for nearly 19 years. She has appeared and written for the Skim, the Travel Channel, A&E, and NewsHour's own educator voice. 13 articles she wrote on teaching in the age of coronavirus. Her own students adore her, and we are grateful for Sari's love of history, civics, media literacy, and teaching, and we adore her too. Sari, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here tonight with you, Michelle, and Judy. So I'm going to introduce our amazing guests, and then I'm going to toss it to Michelle, and then I'll reappear. So first, I want to introduce you to our two guests. So we have Michelle Chula Lipkin. She serves as Executive Director for the National Association for Media Literacy Education, or NAMELY. Michelle began her career actually in children's television production in various roles on both corporate and production teams. Michelle has helped NAMELY grow to be one of the preeminent media literacy education associations, not just in the United States, but abroad as well. She launched her first ever Media Literacy Week in the United States 6 years ago and developed strategic partnerships with so many high-profile media companies, including Nickelodeon, and one of my favorites and least favorites, Twitter. On top of that, Michelle is an adjunct lecturer at Brooklyn College, where she teaches media literacy. You might have recently caught her on CNN's Reliable Sources to talk about the role of the media and the importance of media literacy in this election cycle. And then we also have, as many of you probably recognize, if you're regular PBS viewers, Judy Woodruff. She is the anchor and managing editor of the PBS NewsHour. She has covered politics and other news for 5 decades at NBC, CNN, and of course, PBS. Her reporting career actually began in Atlanta, Georgia, where she covered state and local government. At PBS from 1993 to 1993. And then so I guess that was actually just symbolic of the fact that Judy Woodruff has had a long, amazing career. And I could go on, but I went on for so long, Zoom cut me off. So without further ado and further cutoffs, I'm going to toss this to Michelle and hopefully not get cut off again.
Thank you so much, Sari, and thank you, Vicki, and thank you, Judy, for being here and allowing me the opportunity to be in conversation with you. I'm always so pleased to join our partners at PBS NewsHour and NewsHour Extra. It's especially wonderful to be here during the 6th Annual Media Literacy Week. So the intersection of journalism and media literacy education is very significant to me on a very personal level. It's actually what led me to do the work that I do today. So I'm going to get personal. So on December 21st, 1988, when I was 17 years old, my father was coming home from a business trip in London when his plane, Pan Am 103, exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, due to a bomb that had been placed on board by terrorists. As you can imagine, this was a terrible, terrible tragedy for my family to endure, and certainly a life-defining moment, an incident that would forever change the person I was, the way I saw the world, the way I saw myself, the way I understood everything. But it also shaped my relationship with the news in profound and powerful ways. We found out about the plane crash through a breaking news story. We were forced to watch the news to get information. It was through the news that we learned that the first night that there were no survivors. Later on, through the news, we learned that it was a bomb that had caused the crash. This was a time before cell phones and internet. We had to wait for journalists to do their job so that we could get information. And our direct relationship with media and the press began immediately because they wanted to hear from us. They wanted our reaction. And we watched how our story stopped being the headline and became the second story, and then the third story on the nightly news, and then disappear. And for the last 30 plus years, the loss of my dad has played out on the news. So we watched the investigation progress, we watched the trial against the airline, the later trial for the suspected terrorists, the conviction of one of those terrorists, and so on and so on. And so time and time again, we were forced to reconcile our personal loss and grief with its intersection with an international news story. And it's certainly very difficult for me to ever watch the news without directly thinking about the people who are impacted by that news. So whether it's another plane crash or another terrorist attack, a school shooting, a hurricane, I cannot stop thinking about the people impacted by the news story. And I often think about the journalist's role in this context, right? The stories that journalists cover are stories that impact real people. And ultimately, every news story is a human story. So I'm so grateful to have an opportunity to speak to Judy Woodruff about this, and so honored to hear your point of view, and really to ask you a question that I've wanted to ask for so long, which is, do journalists think about the people that are watching the news who have been impacted? And does that play into how you cover tragedy?
Well, Michelle, first of all, thank you for sharing such a powerful, deeply personal and painful story that for you, as you tell us about it, I think reminds all of us that the news is not just something abstract, that it does so often involve real people with real lives, and sometimes in good ways, but so often in negative ways, because as we know, so often the news is about things that go wrong. To answer your question, and I'm very glad to be with all of you, and I look forward to spending the hour with you and to talking about media literacy. We all certainly should be thinking about the people impacted by these stories. That is, I mean, I went into journalism in the first place because it was an opportunity to help explain complicated things to people. It was about the people who were receiving the information. I didn't go to journalism school. I studied political science in college, but gravitated to journalism pretty quickly and kind of learned on the job. But it's been part of my DNA from the very beginning to think about the people affected. Having said that, the news is now flying past us at such the speed of light. And even on the NewsHour, which is a program with somewhat slower pace than other news programs, we pride ourselves in taking the news seriously and in not just throwing something out there and not explaining it. We're all about explaining and putting in context and making sure we've got our facts straight. But even in this context, we are in such a blizzard of news right now. It's flying past us in the old traditional way. read the wire services, you read the newspaper, but then there's there's social media, there is the internet, there are other television and radio and print outlets. There are so many sources of news, and we all should be thinking about the people who are impacted. And I think the best journalists among us do. But there's no question, you're right, that so often, because we're too often, I think, driven by, let's get the story out there, make sure it's right. First of all, it should be right. But then we move on to the next story and the next story. And for consumers of news, if you've got a personal interest in that story, it can be tough. It's a big subject. There's all kinds of news. There's economic news. There's news about this election. There's foreign policy news, and there are news about tragedies like the one that your family was caught up in. But we all of us journalists have a great responsibility, and I'm so glad you have underlined that.
You know, you brought up a good point about just the speed of news these days. You know, from my perspective, you know, in 1988, when all of this happened to my family, breaking news was actually truly breaking news. Like, my mother was watching a soap opera when a news anchor came in and interrupted the program. And today there's no such thing really as breaking news, right? Because it's always on all the time. But the 24/7 cycle, there is still spot news. There are still things like terrorist attack. There are still things that happen that you need to respond to quickly. How do you think the advent of social media and the advent of even just smartphones, where people are on the ground, you know, before journalists can even get there, how do you think that has impacted the coverage of spot news events like terrorism?
I think it's been a double-edged sword. It's been good in many ways, in that it's brought people into the gathering of news who otherwise wouldn't have been involved. People can see something, they can contribute that information to everybody on either Facebook or Twitter or some other social platform. So from that standpoint, it's wonderful. It's opened up the aperture, if you will. It's even wider than it was, because it's not, you don't just have to have a reporter with a notebook standing there writing about it in order to make it into the New York Times or the PBS NewsHour or, I don't know, NPR radio. It can be an ordinary American citizen who sees something and reports on it faithfully, accurately. But it's also, it's a double-edged sword, because it's also sped things up so much that I know often accuracy goes out the window. Information gets shared that hasn't been vetted, that hasn't been checked out, that hasn't been put in context. And so today you have, you know, people who see something, hear something on one of their feeds, and they think it's the gospel truth when it hasn't been checked out. Nobody's double checked it. Nobody's looked into it. Nobody's picked up the phone to verify it or talk to someone, which is what journalists do. I mean, it's our job to check things out. I mean, it used to be the ironclad rule. You didn't put a story on the air unless you had two hard sources to confirm it. I would have somebody, when I covered the Georgia State Capitol, tell me something, but I couldn't report it unless I had it confirmed by two sources. So long story short, it's good. It's democratized information with a small d, but it's also made it tougher and to determine, you know, the truth. I mean, the facts from what's not the facts. Mm-hmm. It's made our job harder, and it's put more of a responsibility on you, the news consumer, to figure out, what can I trust, what can I believe, and what should I be skeptical about.
Well said. Sari, I don't know timing wise if we have time for another question, or I know there's a lot of people that want to ask questions, so I don't want to monopolize it. I see a lot of questions. So I'm going to continue being a part of the conversation. Judy, thank you for your time. But Sari, I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, that was such a wonderful conversation. And thank you for sharing such a personal story and bringing it back into media literacy, even though it's such a personal story. So we have so many questions in the chat. We have time for two. So I'm going to start with Catherine's. Catherine Vaughn asks, how do journalists on a national level deal with news fatigue? she goes on to ask, her follow-up question is that she watches her hometown paper editor boss struggle with it. And then she says, as a teacher, I feel like it would be similar to teacher burnout. So I guess the general question is, how do journalists on a national level deal with this news fatigue that people are feeling even at the local level?
It's such a great question, because we do go through periods in our history, in our current lives and in our history, where it feels like we're on what is it, the proverbial wheel, where there'll be some fight going on in the Congress, for example, over healthcare or over aid for the coronavirus. And then the same thing will happen a week later and a week later and a week later. There'll be the same squabbles between the White House and the Democrats, or between the Republicans in the Senate and the Democrats in the House, and so on. And you do feel that you are hearing the same news over and over again. I know I used to feel that way for the longest time, about news out of the Middle East. I hate to say this, but there would be some sense that peace was in the offing. There would be an agreement that the two sides or three sides would be working on, and then it would all fall apart. And I felt like we would be walked up to the brink of an agreement so many times, and we covered it seriously. We would interview all the people involved. We would take it, as I say, seriously, but then it wouldn't turn out. And you almost got to the point where you thought, is it ever going to work out? Is it ever going to work out? And of course, here we are all these years later, and we're still waiting. There's been some advancement toward peace, but ultimately the Palestinians are still waiting. So I guess, to answer your question, we can't let ourselves get burned out. We can't let ourselves get tired. If you're committed to journalism, which I know I am, and my colleagues are at the NewsHour, and so many other reporters I know in Washington and around the country, it's what we do. I mean, we are committed to informing the American people and informing everyone who needs information in order to function as a citizen. And that's a big job. It's a lot of responsibility on us to get it right, to get it to be thorough, to put, as I said earlier, to put it in context. So we can't get tired of it, despite the fact that sometimes it feels like we're looking at the same thing over and over again. So Catherine, it's a great question. And I'm going to admit I'm human. And so sometimes I feel like I've seen this movie before and I can almost predict the outcome, but it's incumbent on us. If it's something that matters, if it's an argument about funding for education, if it's an argument about peace in the Middle East, if it has to do with how do we treat people with COVID, those things matter. They matter in people's lives. So it's our job not to get bored and to make them as interesting and frankly urgent, and I mean that in a good way, I don't mean that in an artificial way, as possible, so that people will be more interested in following that story.
Thank you so much. And I, as a teacher, I can relate to the fact that we have to fight that fatigue. And I appreciate your honesty that, but you're about the fatigue, but your love for something is what continues to fuel you, even on those days where it feels like I've seen this story before, or I've taught this lesson before. So thank you for that. So we have so many great questions. And just because you talked about interests and stuff related to the news, Christine asks, how do we keep young people interested in the news when the media has become so politically polarized? And one thing that there are many things that I love about the NewsHour, but I love that you continue to stay nonpartisan and try to avoid that. But it's especially, you've gone through so many different cycles of elections and different presidents, but I think that's an interesting question in terms of how do we keep young people interested, especially during these polarized times again?
Well, one of the main ways we can is by to get back to the previous question, by not getting burned out, by not getting cynical, by not assuming that we have all the answers. I frankly am very sad about how polarized, of course, the country is, but also how polarized much of the news media has become. Not all. The NewsHour, we're very committed to being a place where people of every political persuasion can turn for information that they can count on. We think it's essential that in this complicated world that we live in, that there's a place people can go where they know they can trust the information they're getting. We are committed to that, and so many other news organizations I trust and I turn to for information believe the same way. But in the middle of all that's happened over the last few decades, we've also become a much more opinionated media. I think for the longest time, it was carefully labeled. You know, you had the news pages in the newspaper, and then you had the editorial page or op-editorial pages in the newspaper. On television, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when the ABC, CBS, and NBC Evening News, they would have the anchor, the Walter Cronkite or the Huntley Brinkley. Then they would have occasionally somebody come on who was sort of the gray, wise man guy. It was always a male reporter, longtime observer of American life, who would come on at the end of the show for about 2 minutes and kind of express an opinion, nothing like what we see today in our crazy atmosphere. But it was carefully labeled as, here comes opinion. And as long as it's labeled, I'm fine with it. What I have a problem with is when reporters end up sliding into more than analysis. I mean, I think there's a way to do analysis if you're a reporter who knows your stuff. But when you slide into, what do I think? What do I believe? What do I kind of want to have happen? You're no longer a reporter. And the key for me is making sure the public can tell the difference. And sometimes it's just not easy to do because reporters aren't straight. Some news people, I think, are not so straight. There are entire channels and news organizations now that are built around opinion. And they say they're reporting, but they really are reporting with a slant. I mean, they're looking for news that fits their point of view. And that's not the kind of journalism I want to do, but it's very much out there. And to get to your point quickly about young people, I want young people to know that there is a place that they can go for straight news, so they don't have to feel pushed to have an opinion. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with having an opinion. It's great. It's what democracy is all about. Thank God we can have opinions in the United States and we don't get dragged out, thrown in jail, or shot because we don't agree with the government. So thank goodness we have this freedom that we do, but we still need to fight to uphold a strong and straight press, which is what we need to model for young people.
Absolutely. And I appreciate your commitment to objectivity. And it's definitely a place where I direct my students because I want them to see that. Because yes, I agree, forming opinions is what we want students to do, young people do, and then adults as well. But we want to give them the facts and not necessarily put them in, we want them to get to the place of an opinion themselves without forcing it on them. So I appreciate the work and your commitment to doing that for your entire career.
Opinions based on facts.
Opinions based on facts, right?
I'm glad you said that, Judy. Informed, yeah, informed.
Informed, right. Because we have a lot of uninformed debates in our society these days, but I think we always have, right? I know that Judy is, speaking of election season, I know that Judy is probably very busy. We have a couple more questions in the chat. I wanted to see if you had time for one more question, or if we can just, I have one question for you, but if we could get 2 questions in, but if you have to go, I will ask my question that will summarize all the questions, I promise.
I'm fine.
Great. Okay, so the chat has exploded, but there was one that I had put a pin in, and I think it's of interest to me, and I think a lot of people right now. And the question was about diversity in the news. So I'll ask you this one. The question, I think it was from Dwayne, if my memory serves me correct, from like 10 minutes ago. Sorry if your name isn't Dwayne. I believe Dwayne asks, how is the push for diversity and inclusion changing how news is being vetted, edited, and reported? And then, is it a priority? So how is diversity and inclusion changing how news is being edited, vetted, and reported?
Well, Dwayne, thank you. Such a wonderful, important question right now. I mean, it's always important, and especially in this year when we've had the debates that the country has had, the reckoning, if you will, over racial justice in this country. It's interesting, the media, you know, we've been so good over the years at pointing a finger at other institutions, and calling them out for being fair, for being sensitive, for being balanced when it comes to questions of race. And yet we in the media, I think, have not always at all stood up ourselves to that very standard that we impose on other institutions, on politicians, on people who serve in public life, on you name it. But we haven't held ourselves accountable. We are doing better, but we still have a long way to go. Today, I would say I've never worked at a news organization that didn't say our goal is to be as diverse as possible, is to look like the people we cover. Having said that, we haven't met that standard, and we're always striving to do better. It is absolutely a high priority at the NewsHour. It has been from the very beginning when Jim Lehrer and Robin McNeil started it back in 1975. They brought on board as their principal correspondent Charlene Hunter Gault, who was a major figure in the civil rights era. She integrated the University of Georgia. Charlene became the face, one of the prominent faces of the NewsHour from the very beginning, and stayed with the program for many years. When Eiffel came along, as you mentioned, in the late 90s, this was in a period when I had taken, I guess, a detour, you would call it, to a cable channel, CNN. Jim Lehrer used to say I went wandering in the wilderness of cable news for a few years. But it was while I was away, Gwen came to the NewsHour, quickly became an essential and absolutely adored and admired figure as a journalist, as a woman, and obviously as a pioneering journalist, a woman journalist of color. And then when I came back to the NewsHour in the mid-2000s, Gwen and I were both correspondents. After Jim Lehrer retired, we co-anchored the program together. But to get to until her untimely passing in 2016. But to get to your question, we need to do better. It is, we have made a conscious effort at the NewsHour to bring in more, not just individuals of color, Black correspondent on the air. Yamiche Alcindor, I point to Yamiche with great pride because she has been such a standout, such a courageous journalist covering the White House for these last 4 years for the NewsHour. But also behind the scenes as editors, as reporters, as people doing technical work, writers. We are constantly thinking about that. And not just that, thinking about the guests that we have on the program. Who do we interview? Do we, if we have a choice like tonight, we made an absolute conscious choice. I was interviewing political reporters in 3 battleground states, Texas, Florida, and Michigan. And we absolutely made a commitment at the beginning of the day. One of these journalists is going to be a person of color. I ended up interviewing a young woman, extraordinary reporter with the Texas Tribune, to talk about the Texas presidential contest. So, I mean, it's in our DNA. We are committed to it every day. And I'm going on way longer than I intended to, but what I really want, the point I want to make is that it does make a difference in our coverage, because I think there's that often it does, we do need, not often, we always need to have that additional perspective, eyes, ears, brain, thinking about what we are doing from individuals with different backgrounds. And I can't do it by myself. Other members of our team can't do it. We have to be diverse or we can't report on the country. It's really as simple as that.
Thank you. And I know we all appreciate that. And the saying is something along the lines of, if you can't see it, you can't dream it, right? So I appreciate that you're thinking about who's watching and keeping that in mind and how you're covering everything, including this election season. So the theme of this whole event is media literacy. And Natasha is holding us to that. She asked us early on, so I want to get to her question. And I'm going to throw it to Michelle and then back to you, Judy. The question is, I feel like we planted her, but we didn't. She asked, she wanted to hear both of you, how you understand media literacy, and then what role both you and Michelle think media literacy should play in our society. So Michelle and then Judy, would love to hear both your takes on that.
Well, I think I might even know the Natasha that asked that question, but and she knows me well, so I can say I think that media literacy is the most important thing. It's not surprising. I run an organization to advance media literacy education around the globe, and media literacy it expands to it kind of encompasses everything that we care about, and no matter what it is you care about, whether you are passionate about sports or passionate about politics or passionate about the arts, you are being affected by the media around you, right? Media impact all of us all the time. It doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. This is actually the one thing that could possibly bring us all together, is the fact that we are all influenced by media messages all day long, every single day. So media literacy education should be an absolute national priority. There should be no question about it. And I have to say that one of the most disappointing parts of just the recent debates and conversations about our country is that we're not talking about education hardly at all. And it is so vital. And I think that if we don't make it a national priority, it's going to be hard. It's malpractice. It's like we have to be doing better.
And I was going to say, just as a tangential remark, that it's one of the things we are absolutely committed to at the NewsHour, because we've done a series of reports, and frankly, we can't do enough on the struggles that parents, teachers, educators across the country are having right now in this just unprecedented time with the pandemic and the questions of health and safety of children and educators and parents trying to juggle it all. So we're trying to do a lot of reporting on that and the broader education questions around funding and so forth. But I'll just be very straightforward on media literacy. To me, there's nothing more important in that basket, if you will, than making sure our children grow up able to distinguish between information they can trust and information that they can't trust. And whatever you can do, we can do as you can do as educators, what we can do as journalists to help them see the difference, to become discerning consumers of information, to know that if you go to this source, you can generally rely on it, still be questioning, still be skeptical, nothing wrong with that, always ask the question. Whereas there are other sources that you really need to be careful about. And it's to me, it's just a part of the process of learning, of growing up, of figuring out, what in the world, who should you generally trust and who not. And it's something, we all learn as people. But in terms of the information that's so essential to make decisions as citizens, as parents, as employees, people co-workers, colleagues, we need that kind of information. It's absolutely essential.
I agree. And I think it starts the minute that children can read, right? And another question related to this comes from Mary. And it connects because she asked, Mary Patton, I'm not sure from where, but thanks for this question, Mary. What strategies are most important to help students to practice viewing news and evidence objectively and not through the lens of political bias. And really also just basically this question is about what are the best practices in helping our students read the news and find bias, which is something that I struggle with too. And I'm a veteran teacher, probably like Mary.
Is that for Michelle? Or?
That's from Michelle. This is either one of you. Maybe both, if you don't mind. Michelle, can you answer that, and then we'll get Judy?
Sure. So I think that it is interesting. I feel like we talk a lot about bias, so I'm going to kind of harp on that part of that question. We talk about it. We talk a lot about political bias in the news, and I think we talk about bias as if all of it is a incredibly dangerous 4-letter word. And what we need to recognize is that all media messages are biased. They're all, and there's a spectrum of bias, and bias is it can be perspective and it can be point of view. All media messages, all of them have a point of view. They're constructed by human beings that make choices. And just like Judy was saying, like the NewsHour makes conscious choices about who to hire, who to cut, all of that. So those choices, lead to really interesting decisions. But that's a choice that the NewsHour is making, right? Like another place is going to make different choices. So you're going to get a different type of news. And then you need to decide what is best for the way that you want to watch the news or the things that you want to understand. So I think it's really important to make sure students understand that the question is never, is this bias? It's recognizing what is the bias? How does that help? How does that affect the way the story is told? It doesn't, and bias doesn't, just because it's biased doesn't mean it isn't reliable, it isn't truthful, all of that. That's how I always start with that idea of that. You never want to ask, is this bias? It's all bias.
Thank you so much for saying that. I think that it's become a trope in our discussions about media literacy. And I am so happy that you said that bias isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not an evil thing. And it's also not necessary. And it's just part of just being a human being telling a story. There's an element of bias. So thank you. Judy, do you want to give us some of your thoughts on bias and how PBS handles that and how you've handled that as a veteran journalist through the years?
Well, it's something, one of you used the word, maybe it was Michelle a few minutes ago, objectivity. And it is something that maybe it was you, Sarah Beth, we do strive to be fair. I would say it's impossible to be objective for me. I'm a human being. I'm the sum total of all my experiences. I was born in Oklahoma. I was raised as an Army brat, if you will. I moved all over the world. And had the experiences that I had going into journalism. I've lived in Washington for several decades, so I'm now a product of the nation's capital in many ways, even though I try to get out and see as much of the country and talk to people as much as I can. This is where I live. So I have all those lived experiences. That's who I am. I'm a woman, I'm a mother, I'm even a grandmother, happy to say. So that's a given. I don't pretend to be a machine. I'm not a computer. I think, I have views, but it's not my job my first producer, when I went to work as a reporter for a local station in Atlanta, his advice was, go out and cover the story and just bring back the information. Nobody gives a damn what Judy Woodruff thinks. We want to know what's going on in the world, what's going on at City Hall or in the state legislature. And that stayed with me. It's that's what I do as a reporter. But, we live in a much more complicated time, going back to what we were talking about several minutes ago, about how we are swimming in a sea of news, and so much of it, frankly, is not borne out by facts. We have political leaders at the very highest levels who are saying things that cannot be borne out by facts. And so it's up to all of us, every one of us, as whether we are a teacher or a principal or a parent or a journalist or a secretary or a lawyer, whoever we are, to be skeptical, or a teenager or a young student, to be skeptical about what we read and what we are told. Ask why. Okay, how do we know this? I think, and I'm sure all of you do this as educators, when you are teaching children, I'm sure you teach them not to just take things at face value. You teach them to ask questions. That's how we learn. It's how we, we begin to sort of develop our own framework of the world. And it's a framework grounded in reality. I mean, I can't tell you how many people let me just say recently, I've been talking to voters around the country, and the number of beliefs that they share that are truly not grounded in anything that can be borne out by fact is truly astonishing. I mean, there's just a lot of information out there. People believe conspiracy theories. They believe that so-and-so did something, or somebody else had something going on, or that so-and-so's a crook. So-and-so, took money from I mean, without naming names, there's just a lot of that going on. And I'm not saying all of our politicians are perfect. Obviously, they're not. A lot of them made mistakes, are making mistakes. But we need to be skeptical about all that. And we need to ask questions and hold reporters accountable and hold each other accountable. And I think that we can teach children that at whatever level, they're ready to ask, when they get ready to ask questions, let them ask, and, encourage them, encourage that skepticism. It's going to stand you in good stead. And the other thing I will just say quickly is, don't rely on just one source of information. Try to listen to several, and probably from doing that, you can get kind of a sense of which news organizations take their role seriously and do vetting and confirming and background information and supply quotes and documented evidence, and they cite the census numbers or the Labor Department numbers on employment, or, I mean, I could go down the list, and they don't just make some wild claim without any details. There are differences between news sources to trust and which you can't.
Thank you so much for that. And this actually dovetails really well into the next question I want to ask, and then I wanted to then Vicki to jump back in and talk about the new website. But Michelle, I wanted you to weigh in really quickly on what Judy was talking about related to this. I think I wanted to just hear, did you want to add on to what Judy was just saying?
Well, I wanted to make sure, I realized that we didn't really do a lot of framing around media literacy education. And I just wanted, one of the things that I think people forget about when we talk about media literacy education is the literacy part of it. That really, like, what we're talking about, if you really think about it, is what does it mean to be a literate citizen in today's world? And if we think about, author and consuming all media, when you start to think about a person being media illiterate today, is what a literacy, and we know what that means in our society. We know how dangerous and how disadvantaged people who are illiterate are, right? And so we have to recognize that as this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a new literacy. And I also want to make sure that, for those that are like really interested in taking a kind of a deeper dive into media literacy, that there's so much, there is so much media out there that isn't news, right? That is entertainment and advertisement and all of these things. And there's tenets of media literacy like representation and deeper look into bias and perspective and just the economics of media. And so just recognizing that media literacy is like rich with all of this discussion, which is one of the reasons that I love teaching it, because it's like you can do everything. And just really like encouraging people to really be willing to like roll up their sleeves and dive into all of those different aspects.
I want to take your class. Just throwing that out there. I might, now that you're probably doing Zoom classes, it might be easier for me to just kind of roll up. But yeah, thank you for framing that a little more, because there are so many elements to this pretty complex topic. So speaking of complex topics, I wanted to ask Judy, and then you, Michelle, and then have Vicki come back in and talk to us about how we can use the new website, Journalism in Action. So this election season, I know that every election season that we live through, we think is the craziest one. But I'm just going to put it out there. It feels like the craziest one until the next one. So Judy, I wanted to ask you how you and your team are covering this election season, and are you approaching it in a different way than you have other election seasons? Or is it a similar formula that you're still trying to follow?
Well, I'll just put it right out there. I've been covering elections since 1976 when Jimmy Carter ran for president. There's never been an election like this one. It's been very different. We've never had a president like this one. He's sui generis for so many reasons. We've never had a president who had not been involved in public service before going to the White House, or including in the military. I mean, I think of President Eisenhower had not been in political life, but he had been in the military supreme allied commander and so forth. So this is the first time someone has come in completely from the private sector, someone who's a reality television star, to come into the White House and essentially put his imprimatur, his brand on leadership in this country. This is someone who's very skilled at making news. I was part of a conversation earlier today, and I call President Trump a news machine. He's truly talented at, in fact, he's brilliant at figuring out how to inject himself into the news cycle so that virtually anything we cover, you know, domestically, internationally, the president, whether it's a cultural story, football, professional football, if you remember the whole controversy over kneeling, the president injected himself into that. So we've really never seen a president with these skills and this, shall I say, this energy around his ability to inject himself into so much of what's going on in American life. And it's called on us as reporters to cover his presidency, and now this candidacy, the campaign, in a different way. We've had to be on our toes 24/7. There is no moment when it's quiet. There may be a tweet in the middle of the night, or a statement, or an interview, or another executive order signed to do this or undo that. And we have to pay attention to all of it. I know people often say to me, why do you cover the tweets? It's because he's the president of the United States. He's the most powerful person in the world. The president of the United States has enormous power. And we can't just look the other way and say, oh, we're tired of that. He's done a lot of that. What he does and what he says can matter. Doesn't mean everything matters. We have to use judgment calls. Some things carry more weight, have more consequence than others. But his very presence in this campaign makes it different from any other. Joe Biden, on the other hand, much more conventional American politician, served in the Senate for 35 years, vice president for 8 years, and now, of course, running for president himself. And just with a completely different individuals, different philosophies. I'll just wrap up by saying it's a challenge. We are constantly asking questions. We are reporting on the differences in their position on issues, from education to the environment, to dealing with the coronavirus. I think it's fair to say the pandemic is issue number one. But the economy is hand in hand with that, issue number 2 or 1.5, and then on down the list. We've talked about education. We've talked about healthcare. We try to cover the issues. We try to cover these people. And it is also a campaign about character. People are looking at the character of Donald Trump and the character of Joe Biden and deciding between the two. And it's a close election. I mean, the polls have Joe Biden up at this point, but we know the polls can change. People's opinions can change. So we don't know what will happen. We have to take this very seriously, and we are.
And I appreciate that. And thank you so much. I'm going to start using the phrase, I will attribute it to you, but Donald Trump is a news machine. That is a great way to put it. I wanted Vicki Vicki, one thing that I do as a teacher, and I try to do, and I feel a little better hearing from you, Judy, that this is unlike any other election. As a history teacher, what I often do is I try to put context to current elections. And I have been having a very tough time myself trying to connect this. But I do know that Vicki, that the Journalism in Action website provides us with a lot of amazing resources to not history rhymes, right? It doesn't repeat itself. And in this case, I don't know if it's even rhyming. But Vicki, how can we use Journalism in Action as educators to promote media literacy and sort through this current turbulent time?
One of the best things I learned from Michelle Chula Lipkin, who's on the call with us, about media literacy was it really gives teachers and educators an opportunity to talk about controversial or tough issues with kids. It's like a different way to do it, because sometimes current events is so, it just gets everyone's emotions going. But when you're able to put things in context and look at media from other times in history, that can help. That can be a window into the discussion with students. So when we look quickly at the Journalism in Action website, we see that we have a case study on the American Revolution and early republic. I know, Judy, you said you started covering elections in 1976. We're going way back to 1800. And this election, if you recall, between John Adams, or I don't know how you would recall it, but just from your history books, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and it was mudslinging to the umpteenth. And it was the election of 1800. If you recall, Hamilton played a key role. Aaron Burr ends up becoming Jefferson's vice president, and they hate each other. But anyways, looking at the primary sources and seeing what journalists were covering and how they were covering events from a long time ago could help kids either understand what's happening today or talk about the issues a little more. So here is an editor from the Sunbury and Northumberland Gazette, and he's criticizing John Adams ahead of the election of 1800. The editor, the journalist, was arrested, tried, and convicted under the Sedition Act. This is what I mean by the window or the lens into today, because journalists are under fire. I know, Judy, the Committee to Protect Journalists gave you a huge award, and this is a very important organization, not just journalists in other parts of the world, but even journalists in the US. So let's say I was reading this article and from 1800, and I'm a student and I want to make a little annotation and say something about this quote here. And it saves it, it brings it down to the bottom. I just wrote this quote because we're running out of time, but it lets kids really dive into the resources. And hopefully by doing that, they're learning about the past and they're making connections to the present. And I love what you said about it rhyming, Michelle, but, sorry, Sari. But anyways, it's just, maybe you can talk just quickly about that, Michelle, about sort of how media literacy lets you talk about controversial issues like election 2020.
Well, I think that, media literacy doesn't need to be a subject to teach. It can be a how to teach, right? It can go across curriculum, and it should go across discipline and cross subject areas. And by asking questions and engaging students in conversation, and also doing it in a way that can be, you can do it very creatively, where it doesn't have to be about personal beliefs and bias, and it can be just generally about, historical conversation. It's an incredible tool. And I always say that media literacy is just something that can enhance your teaching, right? So that teachers don't feel like it's something they have to do on top of everything else, because they have so much to do. So how can we help them and support them? And I think these kind of I think the platform's incredible. So these kind of resources can really help do that. I do also just want to say one thing that you didn't mention, Judy, when you were talking about the election, is just how hard a journalist's job is today in this environment, in the fact that it's a very unfriendly environment right now for the press. And I do want to just acknowledge how hard it must be, and just to thank you for still fighting the good fight and doing it, because it's not easy.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. I just want to return the compliment to all of you who are on the front lines of teaching America's next generation. I'm in awe of what you do. I really am. I just think you touch lives. And I mean, I remember my teachers along the way and the ones who had the most impact in my life. And I'm in awe of all of you. So we
Right
can make
back
this a
at you.
mutual admiration thing.
Yeah, fan clubs all around.
Yeah, I think we all work together and we all inspire each other. But I will say that as a history teacher, I am so excited to use this site. I'm so appreciative of the work that Michelle does with media literacy. It connects so well with what we're doing as social studies teachers, because we have luckily started to look at history education as an active thing. It's not about memorizing facts, but it's history in action, and it's thinking like historians. And part of thinking like historians is thinking about being critical readers and thinkers. And so the work of media literacy really connects, and having amazing role models like Michelle and Judy Woodruff for us really helps us with our jobs as educators. So thank you so much. This conversation has just been so enlightening. And like I said earlier, there's so many questions in the chat and comments that we could probably fill, like always, but even more so tonight for obvious reasons. We could probably go on for another 2 hours, but again, it is election season. I think that everyone's a little busy with that. But I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight, everyone for your thoughtful comments in the chat and questions. And I also want to, of course, obviously thank our two guests, and I'll throw it back to Vicki, who made this all possible.
Thank you so much. I've loved it.
Oh, I'm so
Thank you.
glad. So we will definitely share the chat in a very nice and neat, organized way with you over email. And we'd love to stay in touch and build an even stronger media literacy community and journalism in action. There is a place to sign up to get periodic updates about the website, how to connect events from the past to current events. And I wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart to Judy and to Michelle. And thank you to our host, Sari, and to all of you who joined us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such a treat to be with all of you. Wishing you the best.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vicki, for having me.